The afternoon heat pressed down on Fort Sterling like a punishment. The asphalt shimmered as if it might melt, and the air above the main gate seemed to vibrate. Private first class. Aaron Miller leaned against the booth window, his sleeves rolled too high, his uniform wrinkled and streaked with sweat. Sergeant David Cole sat nearby on a folding chair that had seen better days. His cap tilted low, one boot untied, eyes half on the road and half on the empty horizon. Their rifles hung correctly, slung across their shoulders, but their posture made it clear they had not expected anything important to happen. A soft breeze kicked up dust from the roadside and scattered it across the checkpoint. The gate's metal frame creaked as the flag above it fluttered weakly. Miller lifted a bottle of water, took a long drink, and muttered something about how this place could bake a man alive. Cole grunted in agreement and checked his watch, noting how slowly the day moved toward 2:30 p.m. The small details of neglect surrounded them, peeling paint on the guard booth, a half-faded sign that once read, "Authorized personnel only," and a logbook filled with smudged signatures. Fort Sterling had been quiet for too long, and its silence had bred carelessness. From down the highway came the low hum of an engine. Miller squinted through the glare and saw a black Chevrolet Suburban approaching, dust curling behind its tires. The vehicle slowed, rolling to a stop in front of the gate. Its windows were tinted, the license plate clean, the kind of car that usually meant someone official, though neither man straightened. The driver said nothing, keeping his eyes forward. The passenger door opened, and a woman stepped out. She looked out of place in the desert heat. Civilian clothes, neat but plain, hair tied back, face calm and unreadable. She carried a small leather folder under her arm. Even without a uniform, her posture was unmistakably military. Cole sat up a little, uncertain, while Miller stayed leaning against the booth. He greeted her with a lazy, "Ma'am, this area's restricted." The woman met his eyes and replied evenly that she was here to assume command of Fort Sterling. Miller chuckled under his breath, turning to Cole with disbelief. "Sure thing, ma'am, and I'm the Sergeant Major of the Army." The joke landed flat. The woman didn't flinch, didn't frown, didn't even blink. The silence that followed stretched longer than comfort. Allowed. Cole shifted in his chair, suddenly aware of how loud the cicadas had become. Miller looked away first, pretending to check the traffic that wasn't there. The woman stayed still, the heat wrapping around her like armor, her calm presence cutting through the lazy air. Something in her eyes made Cole's stomach tighten. There was authority there, quiet, but absolute, the kind that didn't need to announce itself. He looked at the base behind him, at the cracked pavement and faded paint, and for the first time in a long while, he felt the weight of how far things had fallen. The woman turned slightly, scanning the gate, then looked back at the two soldiers. Her expression didn't change, but the message was clear. They had no idea who they were talking to, and by the time they realized it, it would already be too late. Fort Sterling had once been a name spoken with pride. It stood as a symbol of precision, a base where every inspection passed with ease and every drill moved like a single heartbeat. Recruits arrived green and left as professionals, molded by discipline and repetition until excellence became instinct. The sound of cadence once rolled across the parade field every morning, boots striking pavement in perfect rhythm, a chorus of purpose echoing beneath the desert sun. Those days were gone. The paint on the barracks peeled in long curls. The grass reached too high around the sidewalks, and the hum of pride had faded into the dull shuffle of routine. Officers lingered in their offices longer than they stayed on the line, buried in paperwork that excused them from leadership. Non-commissioned officers, once the spine of the Army, now moved like tired caretakers rather than mentors. The spirit of Fort Sterling had not died with a single failure. It had eroded quietly, replaced by comfort and excuses, until mediocrity felt normal. Colonel Elizabeth Reed had read the reports before she came, but paper never told the whole truth. She had served 2 combat tours as an A-10 Thunderbolt Tunki. Pitionni Kormomanduri, leading close air support missions over hostile ground with the kind of calm that steadies others. Her record carried awards for valor and multiple commendations for leadership, but none of it mattered to her now. She had requested this post not for prestige, but for purpose. She was known for turning forgotten units into examples of excellence, not by shouting, but by setting standards that others learned to rise toward. Her reflection caught in the windshield as she drove through the desert. Sunlight traced the faint scar near her left temple. A reminder from a T-6 Texan II training mishap years ago. She often called it her best teacher. Pain has memory, and memory demands focus. The long stretch of road to Fort Sterling shimmered in heat, empty and quiet. She didn't wear her uniform or bring a convoy because ceremony hides truth. She wanted to see the real base before anyone put on their best face. As the main gate came into view, she slowed the Suburban and took a breath. The cracked walls and faded signs told her what she already knew. The problem wasn't equipment, funding, or manpower. It was something deeper. Fort Sterling hadn't lost its strength. It had lost its standard, and she was coming to bring it back. The afternoon dragged on at Fort Sterling's main gate. The same dry wind pushed dust along the asphalt, clinging to every surface like a thin film of neglect. Private First Class. Aaron Miller leaned against the counter inside the booth, a half-empty bag of chips in his hand. Sergeant David Cole sat nearby, filling in the duty log with lazy strokes of his pen, the ink barely visible against the sun-faded paper. The hum of the desert filled the silence between their small talk, the kind that came from boredom rather than companionship. Nothing about the base felt alert. It was the kind of day where even time seemed to sweat. Miller crumpled the chip bag and tossed it into a corner, missing the trash can by a foot. He laughed quietly to himself and said that no one ever checked this gate anyway. Cole grunted, telling him to at least look busy before someone from command rolled through. The words had no urgency. Both men had long stopped believing anyone from command cared enough to notice. The air shimmered with heat, blurring the road beyond the checkpoint until it looked like water. Then, through the haze, the black Chevrolet Suburban appeared again. It came slow, steady, without sound beyond the quiet growl of the engine. Cole straightened a little, more out of instinct than respect. Miller sighed, brushing crumbs from his uniform as the vehicle stopped. The driver stayed silent, eyes forward. The passenger door opened. The same woman stepped out, civilian clothes, composed. She moved with the kind of discipline that couldn't be faked. Miller forced a polite smile and asked if he could help her. The woman opened the leather folder and said she was Colonel Elizabeth Reed, reporting to assume command of Fort Sterling. Her voice was calm and flat, the tone of someone used to being obeyed. Miller blinked, then laughed. He told her anyone could print something that looked official. Cole, standing beside him now, frowned at the folder, noticing the embossed seals, the signatures, the precise formatting of genuine military paperwork. He hesitated, his gut telling him something was wrong. The woman didn't move. She simply waited, eyes steady, the sunlight drawing a hard line across her face. Cole reached for the radio. Post 1 to Base Defense Operations Center. Civilian female claiming to be Colonel Reed, requesting verification. Static filled the channel. He repeated the message. Still nothing. Miller shifted on his feet, the smirk returning, but his laugh came out weaker this time. The silence was heavy now. Even the wind had stopped moving. The woman stood like a statue in the sun, her patience unsettling in a way that felt more commanding than anger. Then the radio crackled. The voice that came through was clear, crisp and official. Post 1. This is BDOC. Confirm identity. Colonel Elizabeth Reed, incoming commander of Fort Sterling, authorized and cleared for entry. The booth fell silent. Cole's hand froze on the radio. Miller's face drained of color, the weight of the words sinking in. The heat pressed down harder. Or maybe that was just the shame. Reed's gaze didn't shift. She looked at both men, her tone as even as before when she said they had delayed a commanding officer from entering her own base. Cole tried to speak, but his words tripped over themselves. Miller started to apologize, but Reed raised a hand gently. "I know," she said. "That's the problem. Down the road." The sound of engines grew louder. 2 official sedans rolled up, tires crunching against gravel. A lieutenant colonel and a major stepped out, uniforms immaculate, their movements sharp. They approached quickly, snapping to attention before her. "Ma'am, welcome to Fort Sterling." The salute cut through the silence like a blade. Cole and Miller stood frozen, unable to move, their eyes wide with disbelief. Reed gave a single nod and turned toward the officers, her shadow stretching long across the gate. The heat shimmered around her as if even the desert itself had stopped to listen. The next morning came quietly, the desert sun rising over Fort Sterling in a pale wash of gold. The air was still, heavy with heat that had not yet burned away the cool of dawn. At the main gate, Private First Class, Aaron Miller and Sergeant David Cole stood side by side, their uniforms pressed crisp, their boots polished until the dust hesitated to touch them. The rifles at their sides were cleaned, safeties checked, and straps squared across their shoulders. They stood at full attention, the memory of the previous afternoon still weighing on their posture. The same gate stood before them, but everything about it felt different. The black Chevrolet Suburban rolled, up again, its tires crunching lightly over the gravel. Neither soldier moved until the vehicle stopped. The driver stayed still, but the passenger door opened, and Colonel Elizabeth Reed stepped out. She carried the same leather folder, wore the same calm expression, and walked with the same deliberate precision that had silenced them the day before. The morning light reflected off the booth window, catching the edge of her face as she scanned the area in silence. Her eyes moved like a lens. She took in everything: the flagpole that leaned slightly left, the chipped paint along the guardrail, the crumpled soda can half buried in the dirt. She studied the faded sign that warned of restricted access, the streak of mud across the base emblem, the uneven curb where years of heat had split the concrete. She didn't need to speak for her meaning to settle over them. Her inspection wasn't about the gate. It was about everything the gate represented. When she finally turned toward them, her voice was quiet, the kind that made the air itself pause. "Do you believe this is the standard of the United States Army?" The question was simple, but it cut sharper than any reprimand. Miller opened his mouth, then closed it again. Cole shifted his stance, his throat tight. The silence that followed stretched, filled with the weight of recognition rather than fear. They both knew the answer. Reed gave a small nod, as if their silence confirmed what she already knew. She told them to report to her office at 1600 hours, 4 o'clock in the afternoon, with a written list of every flaw at this gate, every sign of neglect, every broken procedure, every forgotten detail. She wanted no excuses, only awareness. It wasn't a punishment. It was an order to see. When she stepped back into the Suburban, the vehicle moved off slowly, the sound of its engine fading into the distance. The 2 soldiers remained where they stood, the morning light now brighter on their faces. Cole exhaled first, the sound almost a sigh. Miller said nothing. They didn't need to. Something had shifted between the heat and the silence, something heavier than rank. For the first time in years, they felt like soldiers again. The conference room smelled faintly of coffee and dust, a place that had seen too many meetings and too few results. Chairs scraped as officers and senior non-commissioned officers filed in, some straight-backed, others slouched from habit. Colonel Elizabeth Reed stood at the front, no podium, no projector, no notes. Her presence alone filled the room. She waited until every whisper died, until the last chair stopped moving. And then she spoke with the kind of steady authority that didn't need volume. You cannot demand respect until you live it. The words landed like a marker drawn across a map. Reed's gaze moved slowly from one face to the next, her tone calm but firm. This base doesn't need louder orders. It needs better examples. She laid out her plan without theatrics. Daily cleanliness inspections that mattered. Communication drills, linking Post 1, the base. Defense, Operations Center, the motor pool, and the range until they functioned as one body. Mentorship chains so that no soldier stood alone. Every lieutenant paired with a sergeant. Every sergeant with a private. Accountability ran both directions. Excuses, she said, were not strategies. A few officers shifted in their seats, trying to hide skepticism. One major cleared his throat and mentioned scheduling conflicts, training cycles, and limited manpower. Reed listened without interrupting, then replied softly, "The schedule bends. The standard doesn't." No one spoke after that. The silence that followed didn't feel oppressive. It felt clean, as if the air itself had changed. Over the next week, the change began. At the gate, the same soldiers who had once mocked a colonel in civilian clothes were now leading reform. Miller and Cole worked side by side, drafting new standard operating procedures for entry control. They wrote checklists, tested each step, and revised them until they could be followed in darkness or chaos. Their new protocol began with greeting and ended with clearance, every motion deliberate. IDs were verified against access rosters. Common access cards scanned. License numbers recorded and undercarriage mirrors used for every vehicle. The radio chatter between Post 1 and Bediaki grew crisp and exact, every transmission ending with confirmation codes. They ran drills in the heat until sweat blurred their vision. Volunteers played visitors, some impatient, others hostile. One afternoon, a lieutenant from operations tried to skip inspection as a test. Cole stopped him with a firm but respectful tone. "Sir, all vehicles are subject to check." The lieutenant bristled, then nodded slowly when Reed, watching from 20 yards away, didn't say a word. Her silence was approval enough. Around the base, small changes began to multiply. The motor pool cleared its clutter, tools arranged by function and labeled in chalk. The barracks floors gleamed for the first time in years. Sheets were tucked tight enough to bounce a coin, not for show, but for pride. At 5 o'clock in the morning, formation drills returned, boots striking in perfect rhythm under the pale desert light. Officers began walking the grounds again, clipboards in hand, talking to soldiers by name. Reed's presence became a quiet ritual at dawn, before most units were awake. She walked the base in silence. She stopped to straighten a sign, tighten a flag line, or pick up trash no one else had noticed. Word spread quickly. If the commander cared enough to show up, everyone else did too. Soldiers began to straighten their caps when they saw her shadow before they heard her boots. By the end of the first month, the phrase "we own it" had replaced the old grumbling in the ranks. It appeared on notepads, whiteboards, and even coffee cups in the dining facility. It wasn't a slogan. It was a standard. Ownership replaced orders. Reed didn't praise often, but when she did, it was quiet and personal, the kind of recognition that lasted longer than ceremony. Every small correction became a lesson, and every lesson became a habit. Fort Sterling was beginning to move again, not with noise or chaos, but with the precision of people who had rediscovered purpose. The gate that once slouched now stood as the example for the rest of the base. The new standard wasn't about perfection. It was about care. And under Colonel Reed's calm, deliberate command, Fort Sterling began to remember what the Army was supposed to feel like. 6 months after Colonel Elizabeth Reed took command, Fort Sterling looked like a different world. The parade grounds stretched in perfect symmetry, the grass trimmed to regulation height, the lines of vehicles gleaming in flawless formation. The motor pool, once cluttered with half-maintained equipment, now moved with quiet efficiency. Every soldier wore the same sharp standard uniforms pressed, boots polished, faces steady. Even the air seemed cleaner, the kind of stillness that comes from discipline rather than silence. Above it all, the flag flew high and straight under the desert wind, its colors bright against the pale sky. The ceremony that morning had been brief but powerful. Fort Sterling had earned the Regional Readiness Citation, an honor the base had not held in over 10 years. Reed accepted it with a small nod, her eyes scanning the ranks instead of the cameras. She knew what the plaque meant. Not recognition, but proof. Proof that pride could be rebuilt one standard at a time. When the applause faded, the soldiers returned to work as if the ceremony were just another task on the schedule. That, to Reed, was victory. Late that afternoon, as the sun turned the sky, gold, a black sedan approached the gate unannounced. The guards moved instantly. No hesitation, no confusion. Private First Class. Aaron Miller led the team with steady precision. His voice was firm but polite as he greeted the visitor and requested identification. He scanned the barcode on the Common Access card, verified the authorization through the Base Defense Operations Center, and confirmed clearance in less than 10 seconds. His movements were exact. His tone, professional. The entire exchange unfolded with the smooth rhythm of muscle memory. Inside the sedan, the visiting general watched with quiet amusement. When Miller returned the ID and cleared the vehicle for entry, the general asked who had trained him. Miller's eyes stayed forward, his voice calm and proud. Colonel Elizabeth Reed. Sir. A few yards away, in the shadow of the booth, Reed stood watching. The gate that had once embodied neglect now operated with precision. The soldiers who once slouched now carried themselves like the first line of defense they were meant to be. When the general stepped from his car and recognized her, he straightened sharply and saluted. His words were full of respect. This base looks brand new. Colonel. Reed returned the salute, her expression composed. Not brand new. Sir, just finally itself again. The general nodded and moved on, the sedan disappearing down the road toward headquarters. Reed stayed where she was, her eyes lifting to the flag above the gate. The fabric caught the wind, snapping clean and sharp. The engines faded into the distance until only the quiet hum of order remained. Fort Sterling no longer needed fanfare. It spoke through rhythm, precision, and pride, the steady heartbeat of a place that had finally remembered who it was. Fort Sterling moved with the quiet rhythm of precision now. The base no longer felt tense or careless. It breathed with purpose. The sound of boots on concrete, the click of rifles during inspection, the clear calls of roll and response blended into a kind of harmony. Private First Class Aaron Miller stood near the gate, watching a young recruit stumble through a salute. He stepped forward, adjusted the recruit's arm gently, and explained the motion with calm patience. It wasn't correction through fear anymore. It was teaching through pride. Across the compound, Sergeant David Cole led morning roll call, clipboard in hand. His voice carried across the formation, steady and measured. Each name called was met with a strong reply. When one soldier hesitated, Cole's tone softened just enough to guide rather than scold. He looked different now. The weariness that once hung on his shoulders had been replaced by quiet confidence. Nearby, officers and enlisted soldiers worked side by side, cleaning gear, checking vehicles, and inspecting barracks. Rank still mattered, but respect had become mutual. The work felt shared. Colonel Elizabeth Reed walked the perimeter as dusk settled over the desert. Her boots moved at an even pace, slow and deliberate. She passed the motor pool, the barracks, and the range, nodding to soldiers who stopped to greet her. She said little, but her silence spoke volumes. Every corner of the base reflected her influence, not through fear or force, but through consistency. Leadership, she knew, was not about shouting or demanding. It was about showing. It was about standing firm when others bent and caring enough to correct what had been forgotten. When she reached the flagpole, the last light of evening caught the stars and stripes as it waved clean and proud against the darkening sky. She stopped, hands clasped behind her back, eyes steady on the flag she had restored meaning to. The wind stirred around her, carrying the sound of soldiers laughing softly in the distance, the kind of laughter that comes from belonging. The base that once forgot how to stand now saluted again. Reed's expression stayed calm, but her heart knew the truth. This wasn't just a rebuilt post. It was proof that pride, once lost, could always return. The sun set behind Fort Sterling. Wow. The flag catching the last light as the wind settled into stillness. The base stood quiet now, its rhythm steady, its pride restored. Colonel Elizabeth Reed's story fades, but her lesson remains. Leadership is not about authority. It's about presence, respect, and the choice to hold a standard when no one is watching. If this story made you think about what it means to lead, to serve, or to stand for something bigger than yourself, share your thoughts below. Every salute begins with respect. Subscribe for more stories of courage, discipline, and the quiet strength that keeps our military moving forward.